All right, welcome to the cellular respiration PowerPoint. This PowerPoint should go with the cellular respiration titration lab as well as the cellular respiration literacy handout. Okay, so this is just kind of a guideline, a PowerPoint that I go over with my kids actually before we start the lab. It's really good because it actually is going to take cellular respiration and looking at an organism level and then take them through and break it down to a cellular level. And that's really what we want to do because the kids can understand on the organism level, but it's very, very hard for them to understand the cellular level. So we want to relate that as much as possible so they have a true understanding. All right, so I want to start this to remind the kids, in order to support their survival, their organs must have cells with mitochondria that perform cellular respiration. When we've talked about the cell unit, we've gone through the mitochondria, they know it makes ATP, they know they have to have energy. They get that, but they don't understand how the cellular respiration part actually makes the ATP and how it actually makes the energy. And that's really what we want them to be able to comprehend and to understand at the end of this lab. So, what is the equation for cellular respiration? At this point in time, I'm going to have my students turn to each other, and I'm going to have them try to remember, explain the formula to each other. I'm going to ask them to say it in words, and then also try to say it in a chemical formula as well. As much as they can, you're kind of activating their prior knowledge, and I have found that if you have them turn to each other and kind of share and then just kind of write it down, or you can have them write it down and then just share and double check and see if they're on the same page, it works really, really well. So, turn to your partner right now. What is the formula for, or the equation for, cellular respiration? Come on. Okay, excellent, very good. This is what you should have come up with. Glucose plus oxygen are going to combine to make carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. There's that energy that we were talking about. It also has the formula, the C6H12O6 plus oxygen, which is O2, the carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O. The equation is very simple, but the process that supports it is very complex. And we know that when we go to teach it, very, very complex. So we're going to try to go from big to small and see how this actually works for them. Cellular respiration occurs in nearly all the cells in the body, with most of the key processes occurring in the mitochondria. That's why we think about the mitochondria and ATP. So, when we get to this point and we're looking at this formula, again, we're talking about products and reactants. What are reacting? What are we making? We're reacting glucose and oxygen. That's great. Where does that come from? Have your kids talk about that. Where does glucose come from? Where does oxygen come from? It's in this formula. It's in this equation. But how are they getting into the body? Where does that come from? Have them brainstorm on that. Have them share with the class what they think, where is it coming from, and how is it actually getting into it. And have them talk about that a little bit before you move on. All right. Well, the source of cellular oxygen, we know it comes from the air around us. We also know that air is a mixture. A lot of your kids will forget that air is a mixture. They're going to think it's 100% oxygen, but it's not. It's a good time to remind them that oxygen, or that air has 21% oxygen. Also reminding them that oxygen is going to enter the body through your mouth and through your nostrils when you breathe in. It's then going to travel down the trachea, enter the lungs via the bronchia, and then go into the bronchioles before going into the alveolus. All right. So what's going to happen is, or right now I would have my kids kind of put their hand on their chest, have them take a deep breath in, then have them exhale. Take a deep breath in, and have them exhale. With their hand on their chest, have them feel the rise and the fall of that chest. And talk about why that's going on. It's because their lungs are filling up. Then the lungs are pressing out the air. What's going in? Oxygen. What's coming out? CO2. Okay, have them think about that and remind them, do we think about that every day? Do we think about that? Do we process that? Do you think about your chest is rising and falling constantly? No, we don't think about all that time. All right, well, in the villi, the oxygen crosses the thin membranes of the lung and the alveolus and the thin membranes of the capillary that surround the alveolus. Remember, the alveolus or villi, they're nothing more than sacs of air. That air is the oxygen that they're bringing in. Once the oxygen enters the capillaries, it will be picked up and carried in the red blood cells. So the red blood cells are going to circulate this throughout the body. It's going to carry it to all parts of the cell or all parts of the body. So it reaches all the cells. When cells need oxygen, oxygen is downloaded from the red blood cells in the body or in the blood across the walls of the capillary and then across the walls of the cells where they're available to the mitochondria. So at this point in time, I would also have the kids turn to each other, describe to each other how does oxygen get in. how does actually oxygen get in, and they can do a very simplified version, knowing that coming in the air, it goes into the lungs. From the lungs, it's going to be pushed out through the circulatory system into the blood. The red blood cells, why does it bond with the red blood cells? Well, the red blood cells has what molecule? The hemoglobin that the oxygen is going to combine with, and it's going to take it to the mitochondria. It's also a good time to remind them, red blood cells, do they have a nucleus? Do they not have a nucleus? So you can talk about this and kind of loop in prior knowledge as much as you can. Now we've taken care of oxygen, the next question is, what about glucose? How does glucose make its way to the mitochondria? Well, they know glucose is a sugar. We talked about this with the macronutrients. It comes directly from the diet and the breakdown of other nutrients to glucose. So the foods that we eat, some are going to break down very, very quickly to glucose, and some are going to take a little bit longer before it gets to glucose, and particularly from the liver. Once you swallow your food, it's going to pass from the mouth to the esophagus, to the stomach, to the intestine, and you can see that going on here, and you can talk about as it moves into the intestine, the squeezing that takes place and all the liquids that are coming out, and the liquids are going to then diffuse out into the bloodstream. Of course, we know sugar and glucose is too big. It's going to have to go through facilitated diffusion. What your body doesn't leave is the solid, the waste, that's going to actually end up passing out as poop, and they don't like to talk about that, but that's the truth. And I like to remind them of that as to what's going on. All right, the liver can make glucose from breakdown of other macronutrients and transfer that glucose out into circulation as well. Glucose is then delivered to the cells where needed, much like oxygen is. So when it's in there, they need it, they can take it, they can pull it in, they can use it. So now we've got glucose and we've got oxygen. So how did it get to the mitochondria? Mainly through our blood. Our blood is carrying that, it's carrying our oxygen, it's carrying our sugar that we need, it's feeding into the cells. The cells are going to use that, and they're going to take it, they're going to break it down, they're going to make energy so the process can continue. This is where we can now start getting into cellular respiration, respiration on a cellular level. This is where glucose is going to be broken down. Glucose is going to be broken down to acetyl-CoA. So we know we have glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to take place. We know that takes place outside the mitochondria. Then we're going to go in and we're going to go into the citric acid cycle, sometimes referred to as the Krebs cycle. Acetyl-CoA is transferred into the mitochondrion. Acetyl-CoA is going to enter the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, where CO2 is produced, and the production of NADH and FADH2. I like to refer to those as NAD and FAD because it makes it a little easier for the kids to remember NAD and FAD. They're electron carriers. The NAD and FAD provide the electrons to the electron transport chain. We know that. Here's the electron transport chain. We know that's going to take place in the inner mitochondrial matrix. The electron transport chain is going to use the electrons to power the conversion of oxygen into water and to power ATP. We know the ATP is going to come from that ATP synthase complex that's there. All right, how are we going to remove the waste? The water that is produced by the electron transport chain can be used by the cells as needed or excreted by the body. After it re-enters into circulation, it's going to be delivered to our kidneys and for release by urination. It's good to go over this because we want the kids to be able to see the whole system. And I know those of you who teach anatomy, you think about this and don't think anything about it, your kids are prepared. But those of you who teach biology or your kids haven't had anatomy, they kind of need this, and you don't need to go into a lot of detail, but just kind of a general overview so they understand how this stuff is coming into the body, to the cell on the cellular level, and how it's pushing and it's going to exit out of the body. Carbon dioxide is going to enter the circulation. It's going to release from capillaries at the lungs to the alveolus, and the carbon dioxide is released from the lungs when you exhale. And so that, going back to the hand on the chest, the inhale, the exhale. Inhale, O2 is coming in, CO2 is coming out. That's the oxygen's going in, it's going through, being processed by your cells, and then your CO2 is actually being released. Hopefully that PowerPoint will help you kind of give the kids some background before you go into this lab. And so hopefully they'll have a better understanding of cellular respiration and what's taking place on the cellular level. So this is going to help the kids to make those connections between the two as to when they exercise, when they run, what's going on with their body, and then taking that and realizing that their cells are very much a part of that. They're doing that, they're producing that, they are working very, very hard to provide them ATP and energy for them to be able to accomplish what they need to do, talking about the cells.